Lindsay here, the Frugal Crafter. Today I'm going to show you how to make some fun cards. We are going to make some crazy backgrounds. We're going to use a lot of different products, and basically we're just going to do kind of like a jumping off inspiration using the Pantone color of the year, which is ultraviolet. Now, I didn't have a swatch. It was perfectly the same as ultraviolet. I keep this this old Glidden Fandex for whenever I need color inspiration, and ultraviolet is really, it's more saturated than like this color, but slightly more blue than this too, so it's like a really cool purple. It's actually a pretty tough color to work with, but as an accent I think it could be really powerful, and also getting used to using this color is going to be really wonderful, because by the end of the year, if you're doing craft fairs or selling your work or just sending out cards, you're going to look really chic and trendy by getting this color used. We're going to be using some stamps from our sponsor, Rubber Stamp Tapestry. I did a couple little motifs here. I'm using the, I'll show you the little swatches here. I'm using Pretty Poppies and Watercolor Garden. I think those colors go really well together, and we also get to work on the watercolor trend that's really popular without actually getting out watercolors, because we're going to get messy enough doing the backgrounds. I also took the opportunity to dye some seam bindings so that I would have plenty of this to use throughout the year, and we're going to work with our jelly plates. We're going to just drag out, what I want you to do is just pause the video, go get everything you have that's purple, get your purple paints, get your purple watercolor crayons, get your purple watercolor pencils, get your purple sprays, get your purple ink pads, get it all out. You might not use everything, get your purple paints, but having it there to work from, you're going to realize that you have a bounty of stuff that you can use to make your backgrounds. You don't have to go and buy any special pattern paper. You can totally use what you have with this project, and by using media tools and then grabbing your stamps and your stencils, you can really create some really fun stuff. Your embossing powders, your embossing folders, all of that. We're going to have fun, and we're going to work with some different options, and then you can have a batch of cards. Really, one background will make you 8 cards. I used a piece of 9x12 Bristol board, which is like a thick cardstock that's good for wet applications. These are a couple backgrounds that we'll make today that I didn't end up cutting up to use, but you just get so much bang for your buck when you're doing these types of projects, and I hope you have fun doing a little messy mixed media with me today. So without further ado, let's get to it. We'll want to start off with a thick, heavyweight cardstock or Bristol, some sort of thick paper that's going to be able to take all the wet media that we're going to use. I've got my large jelly plate here, and the nice thing I've realized about this is that I can get a lot of use out of this without making a huge mess. This is a use what you have project, so if I'm using an ink pad and you don't have an ink pad but you have acrylic paint or watercolors or gouache, use what you have because it's mostly just getting media on paper so that we end up with some cool patterns and colors that will go with the theme of our project. I started off here just by adding ink to my large jelly plate here, and then I'm going to add a little bit of paint to that to give it a little bit more body. So maybe you don't have exactly the right color in paint and you need to use some ink too. That's fine. Just make sure that when you're applying it, you're not cross-contaminating your products, meaning I wouldn't want to put the paint down first and then go in with ink, or I would end up with paint all over my ink pad and it would be ruined. So when I put the ink pads down, I tried not to overlap too much because I didn't want to get them combined. I wanted to make sure I kept everything fairly clean, and you can really get a lot with not a lot of supplies. So here I'm just spraying it out, just kind of getting some interesting colors here, and I'm basically going for different shades of purple around that ultraviolet color just to make it a little more interesting, because when you have such an intense bright purple, it can easily overpower stuff. I also decided to give it a few spritzes of a homemade ink spray. I just make it with liquid watercolor and water, and I thought that might give it some interesting kind of texture on my paper. And I'm putting the paper down just on its own first, just to kind of make my own hand-dyed cardstock. I didn't even have any cardstock this color. This is definitely not a color I use that much, so I had to make my own supplies. Otherwise I'd end up going and buying a pack of paper, and I wasn't sure how I would like working with this color because it is such a strong color to work with. So our first print here, we're going to peel off, and see what I mean about having the larger plate? It keeps me from making a big mess on my table because I can contain everything to that plate and still have plenty of room to do a full sheet of cardstock. I'm going to speed up the jelly plate version of this tutorial just to make it a little bit more interesting, because otherwise it's like watching paint dry, and just kind of show you the basic process I'm doing here. I do have other videos on this if you do want to see a little bit more of an in-depth tutorial, but basically I'm, you know, putting media down, putting stencils down, putting paper down, rubbing the back, and pulling a print. And I've got some really fun and unique designs here. Now you are going to see that I end up hitting the hot mess stage quite a bit here, and I'll go back to the prints later, but I think that's part of it. I mean, you experiment, you go a little too far, then you need to bring it back a little bit, and that's all part of the fun. That's all part of growing and learning. So now I have obviously put the plate away, and I am working directly on my 2 sheets of paper that I printed. And the prints don't have the depth that I want, so I'm grabbing some Distress Oxide ink pads and just kind of rubbing the ink pads in, and then I've got some regular Distress ink in purple and adding that to it, because I'm trying to keep everything in the purple realm so that I can just get a nice, rich, multi-dimensional color. I spritzed it with water and then just blotted off the water so I could have that texture that Distress ink and Distress Oxide inks get once you spritz them, and then I'm drying them. Because I find that when you dry, no matter what sort of water media you're using, if you dry between the layers, you end up having greater success as you build your backgrounds. Now this is a product called Twinkling H2Os, which is a really shimmery, super vibrant watercolor, and I'm flicking some of that on. And the result isn't as wow to just press the 2 pieces of paper together and make a mono print that way. And it still wasn't all that exciting, but at least it kind of smushed the sparkle around a little bit. So I grabbed a mermaid marker, which is like an ink-filled pen, and just started to doodle some scribbles. And then I also had a purple Paintastic, which is basically also an ink-filled pen that came out a few years ago, and I scribbled some of that on, then I brayered over it. I mean, this is just pretty much, I'm going to keep layering it until I like it. So I am putting on some color burst powder, and this is kind of where it all goes to pot here, because these pigments are so strong. I always get in over my head, and I have indigo, orchid, and violet, and I really made a mess there. So I put the papers together and brayered over them, and it's such a mess. It's like, just disregard everything I've done to this point because you can't see anything because I have covered it with the pigment powder. But don't worry, even though it does seem like I just kind of wasted everything I've already done, I really haven't. All those layers are still there, even though that's a super dark color. It is very transparent, so you're still going to see everything underneath. And now it had dried, and I'm flicking it with some water, trying to give it some more of that texture, which I did achieve pretty easily because I had put some Distress Oxide over the dried color burst layer, and I did get some interesting looks that way. It almost looks kind of like that nebula sky type pattern. And then I thought I really need to warm this up. Everything just seems so cool and cold. So I'm using some metallic gold paint, acrylic paint, and a cosmetic sponge, and I'm just kind of hit or miss stenciling on the background. I do like that gold on top of the purple. I definitely tend to favor warm colors. So by adding the gold, it made it just more appealing to me. You, of course, could use silver. We're going to be doing some silver and pearl later on the backgrounds when we go to make them into cards. But I thought the gold, it also kind of gave it that royal feeling, but it just also, I feel like, added a nice depth to it. So you could use any stencils for this, really. I just grabbed a few that I had handy, and I was really pleased with the way it looked. To keep things from getting too chaotic, I grabbed that same stencil I'd started off on the first layer with and just kind of hit or miss stenciled some purple onto the backgrounds that I had just done. And then I grabbed some old hot glue stencils that I had made, and I'll try to remember to link the video for that. And I just kind of squirted some spray mist over there. You don't really see the pattern too much, but it does just give it another layer. And that's what I'm doing here, basically, is building up layers. And then I just kind of stamped with the opposite side of the stencil that had the ink still on it. So then I decided that everything had gotten out of hand on my backgrounds, and everything was way too just gaudy and bright and purple. So I took some white and pearl acrylic paint and threw a stencil down, and then decided to do some prints with that. I kind of regretted this. This is one of those situations where I was like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. But again, it's all part of the process. It's all part of the layers that we build up. And, I end up with some backgrounds that I'm happy with in the end. It just goes to show you that with most mixed media backgrounds, there's not a lot of rhyme or reason to it all. It's just playing until you're satisfied with the result. So don't be afraid to try. That's the most important thing here. Just try, just play, and have a good time. I decided I wanted to have some more color and that the last prints made things a little bit too light in areas, so I went over the paper with Distress Oxides, and then I decided I would flick on some water to give it that interesting texture, and also flick on some spray ink to give it some darker spots as well. I basically wanted to bring back that kind of like a distressed rustic look that the Distress Oxides will give the paper, and it worked out pretty well, but I decided that pretty much I'm going to let everything dry while I work on something else. I was running low on my hand-dyed seam binding, so I grabbed some 1/4-inch white seam binding and then some lavender and darker purple seam binding, and I wet them and just kind of threw it into a plastic tub. The purples, I have 2 shades that are already kind of purple and would go with this project, but they were solid color, and I like to have a little bit of variance in my color, so I'm hitting it with that purple ink, and then I have this metallic color burst, and I figured that would be really pretty on the ribbons, especially that were already purple, because that glimmer will stick to the fabric and have that cool crinkled texture, and then it'll catch the light with a shimmer, and it would just be really nice. So I decided before I was done playing in the studio for the day, I would go ahead, wet and crinkle up these and dye these ribbons and let them sit overnight, so that tomorrow when I come to make cards, I will be all set and ready to go with embellishments and everything. So the next day I went down to my studio and took one of the backgrounds that I made and chopped it up into 8 pieces. It was a 9x12 piece, so I got 8 3-inch by 4 1/4-inch pieces from those original backgrounds that I had made, and they looked a lot prettier the next day. I have to say, once they were all dried, they looked so much better. And then I grabbed a small square die cut or die, and I thought that would be great to make a little window in each of these panels, and that would give me a good spot to kind of have a little peekaboo window for my stamping that would be underneath on my white card base. So I'm just using my my die cutter to do that. These little nested dies are really handy for this because you can set them exactly where you want to in a background. It's a lot easier to do this than to try to do it on an electronic cutter, and it's a lot quicker too, I think, for this sort of situation. But you could always use a metal-edged ruler and an X-Acto knife to do the exact same thing, because it's just a square. So if you don't have a die cutter, you don't need one. Make sure you save all the squares that you cut out from the backgrounds, because we'll use those to decorate the inside of the card. So we're going to emboss these panels here, and I'm using one of those super thick embossing folders. So whenever you're using one of those really thick 3D embossing folders, all you do is you run it through like you would a regular embossing folder, except you don't use one of your cutting plates. You just have 1 plate instead of 2 plates, and that will give you the perfect thickness. So in the back you can really see the dimension. It doesn't really show that much on a really bold background like that, so really you could use any embossing folder. I don't think you're getting a special effect by using a super thick one, so they're just kind of fun, but any one is going to look just as nice. And I decided to use 2 different themes. I decided to use a kind of leafy branch one and also a kind of like gem honeycomb looking one, just so I'd have a few different varieties. And that's a great thing about making your own backgrounds, is that you have so many options when you do a batch of cards like this to experiment with different techniques. So here you can see some that I have already accented with some gelatos, and I think it really looks fantastic just doing this additional step. And gelatos are pretty much the same thing as gel sticks, which were way cheaper and marketed to kids. So if you have either of those, they're going to work great, or any sort of like water-soluble oil pastel works really well. So I decided to do my darker colors around the edges of my panel and also around the window. And I'm going to do 2 here, just so you can see how it looks a little differently on the pattern depending on what you pick. Basically any all over pattern that matches your theme is going to look fine. I usually tend to do nature themed things, so you know, branches or honeycomb, or actually any sort of geometric pattern would look pretty too. I'm using my finger to blend the gelatos. I really think my finger works better than anything else. Some people like to use baby wipes, but I would be kind of afraid of wiping off any of the media underneath. Even though we gave it plenty of time to dry, any like unsealed inks may come off if you do that. So that's what I like to do. Plus I don't wash any of the gelato away, so it doesn't use as as much materials. So after I've got the darker frame on there, I decided to take some of this dark purple and add some of that in, especially if I had a lot of blue from that indigo color burst that I got a little carried away with. And any place that's a little too dark, I went in with this kind of pastel lilac color gelato. And that's what I love about monochrome projects. If you go multi-tonal like this, you can really pull in a bunch of different colors. So even if you don't have the exact right color that you're looking for, you can go all around that color and get a really diverse and interesting look. And here I'm using a metallic purple gel stick. And those are great because they catch the raised portions of the embossing, and it just makes it almost look like metal. And now I'm going to do the same with the silver, which really kind of adds the wow factor. And don't worry, because I know people are typing this question right now. I'm going to seal it, and I'll show you how I do that so it doesn't smudge all over people's hands when they handle it. Now, after you've done this much, you can leave it like this because, like I said, we're going to seal it. But sometimes you want to rub a little bit of it if you do have any big gobs or if anything just looks too chunky. So you can do whatever you like. You can see on those where I pulled them out, the samples, they were rubbed down a little bit, so they have a little bit more of a luster and less of a sharp contrast. So, you know, you can do whatever you prefer. And now it's time for my secret weapon. We are going to seal these babies with my favorite Aquanet. And I love to use aerosol hairspray for this type of thing. And I would make sure if you're sensitive to smells, just maybe take a whiff of the hairspray before you buy it and see if that's something you want your cards to smell like. I love Aquanet. I use it in my hair too. So, you know, seriously, if it won't mess your hair up in like monsoon winds and rains, it's going to keep your cards sealed. So I just gave it a very generous coating of this and let it dry. The great thing about having so many backgrounds to work with is experimenting. Now here I thought maybe I'd sprinkle on some embossing powder and see how it looked, and it looked like awful. And then I thought I kind of like the effect, but I want something that's going to work a little bit better. So I came up with another technique, and this was again using our trusty brayer. I knew I wanted some kind of silvery tones in there, and I tried it with the jelly plate. It didn't work exactly the way I wanted to, but this time I actually took the silver and the pearl and off camera just kind of squirted some on my scrap paper there, and then I just rolled my brayer in it, and I just brayered over once, and that just gave it that finishing metallic touch that it needed to kind of have that almost like pressed tin look that I was looking for. So I just did one roll over each of these backgrounds, and I think they turned out really well. Sometimes a bad technique can lead you down the path of a really great one. So I didn't like that embossing powder just randomly sprinkled on my background that I did before, but I thought, this would be really cool if I could control where it went and make up myself a little frame or accent the little window that I cut out. So what I did was I got my embossing pad, which just has glycerin on it, and I used my finger to apply that ink just around the opening of that window, and then I am just pouring on some silver embossing powder only on that area where I had dampened it with the ink. I didn't want to just dump it all over the whole thing and then have the powder get caught in any of the nooks and crannies of the embossed image, and then I flipped it completely over and tapped the back so it wouldn't fall down into any of those nooks and crannies. And then I just grabbed my heat tool and heated it up, and I think it's a really great way to highlight the center area on my card where I'm going to be doing my stamping. Because the background is so bold and purple is such a strong color, I think having a little bit of an accent like this around the window is really going to make my stamping stand out when we get to that portion of the card. And I'm going to show it to you next to one of these cards that isn't embossed, just so you can kind of see, or that doesn't have the heat embossing rather, just so you can see that impact that silver embossing gives it. I think it looks fantastic, and that came from a technique that I wasn't happy with. So just because you don't like the way a certain technique comes out on one project doesn't mean it won't work for something else. With the messy portion of my project done, I decided I would make some envelopes to go with my cards. And basically I just grabbed some pattern paper from my stash. It was looking a little dated that I wanted to use up, but also would be a complementary color that I could use for maybe a die cut on the inside of the card. I'll be making these envelopes so that they're white on the outside and the pattern's on the inside, so you'll just see a little bit of that pattern when you go to open up the card. And I figured a paper that's a couple years past its prime would be just fine for that, and it lets it get used and not in the recycling bin, which I think is just awesome. The template I'm using is a Create-A-Lope by Green Sneakers. I don't know if they're still being made, but you can usually find them on eBay, or you can use whatever envelope template that you have and like. Before working on an actual card, I decided to test my stamping on a scrap of cardstock, and what I did was I traced the window twice on a piece of white cardstock. I tried one pattern with Distress Oxide inks and one with regular dye inks just to see what I liked the best, and I think I liked the one that had more just shades of purple than one that had other colors in it too. And you're going to see a couple different examples at the end, and I ended up liking the one that had almost strictly purple and a little bit of green versus having the yellow in there too. So what you want to do is center up the panel that you're going to use on that particular cardstock and trace it. You have to do this for every one with the panel that's going to go on it, just in case your die cutting was not exactly perfect each time, which, you know, mine isn't. And I'm starting with my biggest stamp here from the watercolor set here, and I'll have everything linked below. I used 2 different peg stamp sets, and I stamped the largest poppy 3 times. When you're working with peg stamps, or any stamps for that matter, it's a good idea to use your biggest elements first, and that will assure you that you can fit everything in. Now that stamping's not perfect, but it's messed up right on the edge of my line there, so I know I'm not even going to see that smudge, so I'm not going to worry about it. You can either build a pattern where you have every element laid out symmetrically, or you can go an asymmetric pattern and just kind of fill it in a more organic manner. And that's the way I like to do it generally, because if you try to keep everything all lined up like soldiers and absolutely perfect and matchy-matchy, if you have one thing just a little bit off, it can look really unusual and really unsettling. So I try to keep my my designs a little bit more random. And I think these 2 sets, the watercolor garden and the petite poppies, just work really well, though they're all designed almost to look like watercolor prints. So I just really like the way they look together. Now for my accent color, I did grab some bamboo shoots. It's kind of like a sap green color. It's very earthy but nice and light and fresh looking, so I added that into the composition. Now I debated whether or not to add yellow into this, because yellow is the complementary color to purple. It does give it a good pop, but it can also look a little garish sometimes too. So at the end of the video, you're going to see one version where I did use yellow and one where I didn't, and you can decide what's best for you. I thought the background looked stark here, so I'm using these little sponge pegs from Doris. They're kind of like a peg stand. They're a little dowel with a little bit of foam on the end that you can use to get ink just into teeny little areas, like in between the little elements on this. After everything was said and done, I actually preferred the version with no yellow. I thought it looked a little more chic, but it just depends on what you're going for. After your stamping's done, you're going to want to put foam tape or foam squares on the back of that mat that you traced, because it's very important you keep the same mat with the same card that you traced, and you just want to put that right on top, and that raises it up and just gives you a really beautiful clean presentation. And the real main reason I sealed that background is so that you didn't smudge purple onto that clean crisp white border. I think it gives it kind of a gallery treatment and looks really modern. Now for the inside of the cards, we are going to do a little stenciling and die cutting. Keep using the same colors of ink you've been using all along for the stenciling, and you can either use a sponge applicator or an ink brush to apply your ink. I find that an ink brush works better if you have a larger opening in your stencil. If you've got a small opening in your stencil, then the sponge gives you a more solid coverage. So it just depends on the type of stencil you want to use, and it's perfectly fine to combine a couple stencils to get the montage that you like. This is a grungy one from Crafter's Workshop, so I'll use a couple different stencils from this sheet to build up the image that I want. I really like the way the different shades of purple ink through the different windows of the stencil gives it a nice dimensional image. Of course, that does make my really dainty flower, that's a memory box die that I decided to use, not stand out so well, so I'm going to actually add a little bit of ink on that flower die to make it stand out a little more too. I glued the square we saved to the inside of the card where the flower head is going to fall, and then to glue the tiny die cut, I'm simply using a needle tool, and you could use a toothpick if that's what you have, to add some glue to the back of the die cut. And you can use any of your matte mediums or white glues or clear glues that you have. I find that a fine tip applicator is really handy if you use it really frequently, but if you're not using it that often, then they clog up, and it's just as easy to just use a toothpick and the regular glue that you use anyhow, and saves you some money and saves you not having to have an extra product. Make sure you give your card plenty of time to dry before you close it, or put a piece of wax paper in between your card if you wanted to close it and put a book on it or something. The great thing about doing the embossing and die cutting is that it flattens out our backgrounds really well if there was any warping. So I wanted to show you this. This is another way to do the ribbons. Tie them together in a knot. Because they're the crinkled seam binding that we made, they have a lot of volume, so you really don't need to put a bow on there, and that also saves it from being too thick in your envelope. And then you have to worry about cutting them at an angle or V-notching them or anything, because you just get this really wonderful texture any way you slice it. If you want to have a sentiment on your card, you can do that also by stamping on the background. So instead of just tracing the window like we did the last time, you're going to trace the window and also trace down the left-hand side just long enough for a sentiment, and that will give you an idea of where to stamp it. And then you could stamp any of your sentiment images there on the edge. And I always just keep a few thank you, happy birthday, thinking of you stamps handy, wood mounted, so I could just grab them when I need a quick card. And I'm just going to go ahead and stamp that right above that line, and then you'd simply erase that line with a pencil eraser after you've done that, and finish up the card like we did with the other one. And here you can see the version that doesn't have the yellow in it. I think it looks more modern this way, and especially with that wider border that we have, it just has more of a gallery feel, and I think it looks a little more chic. And of course you'd finish the inside just like we did on the other card. Now about the envelopes, you may want to decorate them up a little bit, and these two little stamp sets that I used work so well for doing a cute little spray on the tip of the envelope, and I'm going to show you how I did this. We start off with the largest poppy from the watercolor stamp set, and then we're going to use this spray of leaves here in that super dark purple. It's almost black, it's so dark, and just give one to either side. And remember, the little line on the side of your peg stamps will help you line up. And now I'm going to do this tiny little spray of leaves, one up top and one underneath. And again, I'm just trying to balance it. I'm not trying to make it really matchy or symmetrical. I'm just going for an overall balance. And then this little cluster of flowers, we're going to do that in a kind of lavender color for a couple of times. And then with our strongest color being kind of that more fuchsia color, we're going to do the tiny little watercolor poppy, and we'll do that probably about 3 times, because things that are, we want some things to be in an uneven number so that it looks symmetrical. And I think that looks really pretty, and it also gives those older dated papers a little new life, because they're just used as the liner, and I think it looks so pretty. And here you can see the finished cards. I'm really happy with the way they turned out, and you can use whatever color combinations you prefer for these. I hope you enjoyed this play with the Pantone color of the year. I had a lot of fun because it's a color that I don't often use. And if you like the stamps that I used today, make sure you check out our wonderful sponsor, Rubber Stamp Tapestry. You can find them online at pegstamps.com, and don't forget to use the coupon code to save 20% off all stamps at Rubber Stamp Tapestry. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, happy crafting.